Why did the wounded soldier refuse the stretcher and instead struggle to stand at attention in the middle of an emergency room? At 6 in the morning, the emergency department at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth moved like a storm contained inside fluorescent walls. Gurneys rolled. Monitors chirped. Voices layered over each other in the language of medicine. Numbers, orders, questions that had to be answered immediately. And yet in one corner, someone stood perfectly still. Corpsman Tessa Harlo. 5'4", quiet, almost invisible. She had arrived 3 weeks earlier with transfer papers that said very little about where she'd been before. Her name tag read simply, Harlo, Corpsman, age 27. Most people glanced at her once and forgot her. But Tessa was always watching. Not nervously, not like someone overwhelmed by the chaos. Her eyes moved slowly, deliberately, counting exits, distances, angles. She noticed the flicker of a fluorescent bulb that blinked every 11 seconds and then never looked at it again. Because once something was understood, she moved on. Dr. Callum Bridger, the head of the ER, noticed her that first morning and dismissed her just as quickly. He had trained dozens of corpsmen over the years, some eager and loud, others burned out and silent. The quiet ones made him uneasy. Trauma 2 needs restocking, he told her without stopping. Saline and gauze. Yes, sir. That was all she said. Dale Briggs noticed her too. Briggs had the confidence of someone used to being the loudest person in a room. He leaned against the doorframe while she restocked supplies. You the new one? Yes. Transfer from where? She paused just long enough to answer. Expeditionary. Briggs studied her like a puzzle missing pieces. You gonna keep up in here? It moves fast. Tessa closed the cabinet, looked at him calmly. I'll keep up. Then she walked past him. No attitude, no defensiveness. Just certainty. Chief Wade Carver watched the exchange from across the nurses' station. 22 years in the Navy had taught him something most people never learned. The quietest person in the room was often the most dangerous one. And Tessa Harlo moved with a kind of stillness he had only seen before in combat zones. So Carver didn't ask questions. He simply waited. The first week passed quietly. Tessa showed up early, worked efficiently, never complained, never tried to impress anyone. She ate lunch alone by the window, her back to the wall, watching the parking lot below. On the third day, Briggs joked about it. You know there's a table, right? He said loudly to the break room. You don't have to eat by the window like a cat waiting for birds. A few people laughed. Tessa stopped at the doorway. I like the light, she said simply. Then she left. Carver didn't look up from his paperwork, but he turned the page of a chart he'd already finished reading. Something about her didn't add up. The first real test came 5 days later. A 19-year-old sailor was rushed in after collapsing in the parking lot. High heart rate, low blood pressure, cold sweat. Heat stroke, Briggs declared confidently. They started cooling procedures immediately. But Tessa wasn't looking at the chart. She was watching the sailor's chest. The way it rose unevenly. The left side barely moving. She leaned closer. Then she spoke quietly. His trachea is deviated. Briggs frowned. What? Breath sounds absent on the left. Dr. Bridger stepped forward instantly and examined the patient. 4 seconds passed. 4 very long seconds. Get me a 16-gauge needle, he said sharply. Briggs hesitated. You think she's right, the symptoms match. Get me the needle. The decompression was immediate. Air hissed from the chest cavity like a punctured tire. Within seconds, the sailor's oxygen levels climbed. Tension pneumothorax. A rib fracture had allowed air to build pressure inside his chest. If they had treated him for heat stroke, he would have died. Briggs looked at Tessa. She was calmly adjusting the oxygen line. Not watching anyone. Not waiting for praise. Just working. Good catch, Bridger said to the room. Later that morning, Briggs tried to reclaim the moment during shift briefing. One correct call in 2 weeks, he joked. We'll give her a gold star. The room chuckled politely. Tessa didn't react. She stood quietly near the wall, sipping coffee, her eyes fixed somewhere far away. After the meeting, Carver approached her at the supply station. For what it's worth, he said softly, the sailor's mother left flowers at the front desk yesterday. Tessa paused. No name on the note, Carver added. Just 2 words. He waited a moment. Thank you. Tessa set down the clipboard. For a second she stared at the door. Then she resumed counting supplies. Because composure like hers wasn't natural. It was built slowly. Like scar tissue. And Tessa Harlo had started building it when she was 10 years old. Saturday mornings in rural Virginia. Her father standing beside her on a dusty hillside, with a rifle almost longer than she was. Gunnery Sergeant Raymond Harlo. Marine Scout sniper. Eyes open, he would say calmly, breathing steady. Everything else was math. He taught her wind drift from bending grass. The stillness between heartbeats. The quiet patience of waiting for the right moment. She got 4 years of those Saturdays. Then one afternoon in September 2011, 3 soldiers knocked on her front door. Her father had been killed in Helmand Province. A roadside bomb. He was 52. That night her mother sat across from her at the kitchen table. Hands flat on the wood. Face pale. Promise me something, her mother said. Anything. Promise me you'll never pick up a gun. Tessa looked down at her hands. I promise. And she meant it. She kept that promise for 12 years. Until one quiet Tuesday morning in Portsmouth, when she heard a sound in the hallway. A heavy impact outside. Her head snapped toward the sound instantly. Her eyes scanned the highest corner of the room. Her right hand moved toward her hip. Then stopped. Because there was nothing there. Carver had seen it. The instinct. The reflex. The movement of someone trained to reach for a weapon. And the scar along her forearm told its own story. Carver didn't ask questions. He simply waited. Because he knew something everyone else in that building did not. People who carry secrets like hers always reveal them eventually. And when they do, it's never a small moment. It was 7 minutes past 8 when the black Ford pickup rolled into the ambulance bay. 2 flat tires. Engine smoking. The driver fell out of the door and collapsed against the frame. He had 2 gunshot wounds. And he had driven 11 hours to reach this hospital. Tessa was already running before anyone else moved. They placed him on the gurney. She checked his pulse. Fast, weak. He opened his eyes. For 1 second they stared at each other. Recognition flickered behind hers. The man tried to sit up. A paramedic pushed him gently back down. Sir, stay still. But the wounded soldier raised a hand. And the authority in that gesture stopped everyone in the room. Slowly, painfully, he straightened his spine. Despite the blood loss. Despite the pain. Despite the IV lines and the chaos around him. He stood at attention. And spoke 3 words that froze the entire emergency room. Commander Harlo, ma'am. The room went silent. Monitors kept beeping. Phones rang somewhere down the hall. But every human being in that trauma bay stopped moving. Briggs stared at her. Bridger held a chart halfway open. Even the paramedics froze, because the quiet corpsman they had been ignoring for 3 weeks had just been saluted by a green beret. Tessa didn't flinch. She didn't look around. She simply leaned forward and pressed gauze against his wound. "At ease, Sergeant," she said calmly. "You're bleeding out. Let me work." And in that moment, the entire room realized something they should have noticed from the beginning. The quietest person there had never been just a corpsman. She had been a commander all along. But there was something she hadn't told them yet. Not about the program, not about the missions, and not about the name the wounded soldier whispered to her later that night. A name that should have belonged to a dead man. Nash. And the moment she heard it, something deep inside her changed. Because some ghosts never stay buried. And some promises eventually come due. Why would a wounded Green Beret salute a quiet Navy medic and call her commander in the middle of an ER? The question hung in the trauma room long after the words were spoken. Monitors kept beeping, gloves snapped, instruments clattered into metal trays. But the atmosphere had changed. People moved slower now, more carefully, like they had just discovered they were standing next to something powerful they didn't understand. Tessa Harlo kept her hands steady over the wound. "Pressure," she said quietly. Briggs obeyed without thinking. His usual confidence had disappeared somewhere between the word commander and the way the wounded soldier had looked at her. Not with fear, not even respect. Something deeper. Recognition. The Green Beret's breathing grew ragged as the trauma team worked. "Stay with me," Dr. Bridger said. The soldier's eyes drifted back to Tessa. "Ma'am," he whispered. She leaned closer. "Don't talk." But he did anyway. "You said if it ever got bad." His voice cracked. "Come find you." Bridger glanced up sharply. "You two know each other." Tessa didn't answer. Instead, she tightened the bandage and looked directly into the soldier's eyes. "You drove 11 hours, she said softly. "Yes, ma'am." "You shouldn't have. Had to." He coughed weakly. Couldn't trust anyone else. For a moment, something flickered across Tessa's face. Pain. Quick, controlled, but real. Then it vanished. "Focus on breathing," she said. The trauma team rushed him towards surgery. As the gurney disappeared down the hall, the ER fell into a strange silence. Everyone turned toward her. Briggs folded his arms. "Commander," he said slowly. Tessa peeled off her gloves. "Drop them in the biohazard bin." "He's disoriented." "That guy's special forces," Briggs replied. "They don't hallucinate ranks." She didn't respond. Dr. Bridger stepped closer. "You want to explain what just happened?" Tessa looked around the room. At the curious faces. The tension. The suspicion. Then she shook her head slightly. "He needs surgery," she said. "That's what matters." And she walked away. But rumors move faster than stretchers in a hospital. Within 30 minutes, half the ER staff had heard the story. The quiet corpsman. The Green Beret salute. The word commander. Briggs leaned against the nurse's station. "I'm telling you," he said to a group of residents, "she's not just a medic." Carver sat nearby reviewing charts. Silent. Listening. One of the younger nurses whispered, "Maybe she used to be an officer." "Officers don't transfer into corpsman roles," Briggs said. "That's not how the Navy works." "Then what is she?" Carver finally looked up. His voice was calm. "Someone you shouldn't underestimate." Across the hall, Tessa stood alone at the supply cabinet. Her hands moved automatically. Counting syringes. Stacking gauze. But her mind wasn't in the room anymore. It was somewhere much colder, somewhere darker. 6 years earlier, eastern Afghanistan. Night. Mountains so black they erased the horizon. She lay prone on a ridge, overlooking a valley village lit by scattered lanterns. Her rifle rested against a sandbag. Scope steady. Wind 3 miles per hour. Distance 740 meters. Her spotter whispered softly through the headset. Target moving. Tessa adjusted the scope. There, a man stepping out of a truck. Tall, bearded, carrying a radio. Confirmed, the voice in her earpiece said. High value. Tessa slowed her breathing. Inhale. Pause. Exhale. Her father's voice echoed in memory. Everything else is math. But there had been a problem. A little girl stepped into the doorway behind the man, holding his hand, laughing. And suddenly, math stopped being simple. Take the shot, the voice in her headset urged. Her finger rested against the trigger. Seconds stretched. The man turned slightly, the girl still clinging to him. Tessa lowered the rifle. Negative. Commander. Negative, she repeated quietly. The target disappeared into the house moments later. The operation continued without her shot. 3 days later, they learned the truth. The man wasn't a militant leader. He was a school teacher, forced to deliver radios under threat. If she had pulled the trigger, she would have killed an innocent man. And a child would have watched. That night her commanding officer approached her outside the command tent. Captain Elias Ward. You hesitated. Yes, sir. Why? Tessa stared at the mountains. Because I wasn't sure. Ward studied her, then nodded. Good. She looked surprised. Sir, a soldier who never hesitates, he said quietly, is a soldier who eventually kills the wrong person. He handed her a cup of coffee. You made the harder decision. Back in the present, Tessa closed the cabinet door. But memories had a way of arriving when you least wanted them, especially when ghosts were involved. Because the name the wounded soldier whispered earlier. Nash. It wasn't just a name. It was a memory she had buried. Staff Sergeant Jonah Nash. Green Beret. Team leader. The man who had saved her life during a mission that officially never happened. And the man who was supposed to be dead. Carver approached quietly. You all right? He asked. Tessa nodded. Surgery will take a few hours. I know. Carver leaned against the counter beside her. You know what people are saying? Yes. That soldier didn't seem confused. No. Carver watched her carefully. You don't strike me as someone who lies easily. She met his eyes. I don't. Then tell me something true. Tessa thought for a moment, then said softly, he shouldn't have come here. Carver frowned. Why? Because if he found me. She stopped. The rest of the sentence stayed, locked behind her calm expression. But Carver could feel the weight of it. Someone else could too. Hours later, Dr. Bridger stepped out of surgery. He's stable, he announced. Relief rippled through the staff. But Bridger looked directly at Tessa. He's asking for you. Briggs crossed his arms again. Oh, this should be good. Tessa didn't react. She walked down the hallway toward recovery. Each step steady. Controlled. But inside her chest, something unfamiliar stirred. Fear. Not for herself. For what the soldier might say. The recovery room was quiet. Machines hummed softly. The green beret lay pale against the pillows, bandages wrapped across his chest. When she stepped inside, his eyes opened immediately. Recognition again. "Ma'am," he whispered. At ease, she replied gently. "You survived surgery." He managed a weak smile. "Barely." She pulled a chair beside the bed. "You want to tell me why you drove across half the country bleeding out?" His expression darkened. "Because it started again." A chill passed through her. "What started?" He looked around the room cautiously, then leaned closer. "They're hunting the old team." Tessa's pulse slowed. Danger had a sound, and she could hear it in his voice. "Who?" she asked quietly. He swallowed. "Nash." The name hit her like a distant explosion. "That's impossible." "That's what we thought." He reached weakly into the hospital bag beside the bed and pulled out a folded photograph. His hand trembled as he handed it to her. Tessa unfolded it slowly. Her breath stopped. The photo showed a security camera image. A man stepping through an airport terminal. Tall, broad shoulders, dark jacket, and a face she knew better than her own reflection. Jonah Nash. Alive. Walking through the world like nothing had ever happened. The wounded soldier watched her reaction carefully. "We thought he died in Syria," he said. "Everyone did." Tessa's voice barely moved. "Where was this taken?" 3 days ago." Silence filled the room. Outside the window, the sun dipped lower over the naval base. The soldier looked at her with quiet urgency. "There's something else." Her eyes lifted slowly. "What?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "The people looking for him." He swallowed hard. "They know your name." For the first time since arriving at the hospital, Commander Tessa Harlo felt something close to panic. Not for herself, but for everyone inside that building. Because if Nash was alive, and someone was hunting his old team, then the quiet life she had tried to build here was about to end. And the war she thought she left behind had just found her again. But the worst part wasn't the danger. It was the question she couldn't stop asking herself. If Jonah Nash was alive, why hadn't he come to her? And what had he done in the years since the world believed he was dead? Because some men come back from war changed, and some come back as something else entirely. Why would a man the world believed dead suddenly appear in an airport camera? And why would dangerous people start hunting the soldiers who once served beside him? The question followed Tessa Harlo out of the recovery room like a shadow. She walked down the hospital corridor slowly, the photograph still folded in her hand. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, the same steady buzz she had heard every day since arriving at the ER. Normally, she noticed everything. Footsteps, conversations, doors opening 3 rooms away. But right now, her mind was somewhere else. Jonah Nash. Alive. Or at least recently alive. She stepped into the stairwell and closed the door behind her. The quiet there felt different, thicker. She opened the photograph again. The image was grainy, security camera footage from a distance, but the face was unmistakable. The same calm eyes, the same slight tilt of his shoulders like he carried weight no one else could see. Jonah Nash had been many things. A Green Beret team leader. A strategist who could see 3 moves ahead of everyone else. And the one person who had ever understood how Tessa's mind worked in the field. They had met 7 years earlier in a place that didn't officially exist. A joint task unit hidden inside an intelligence program, so classified that even most generals had never heard of it. The team had no official name. Just a designation. Task Unit Orion. 6 operators, no records, no recognition. And missions that only happened when things had already gone wrong. Back then, Nash had looked at her the first day and smiled slightly. "Commander Harlo," he said, offering a hand. She shook it once. "Staff Sergeant." He tilted his head. "You're younger than I expected." "You're older." That had made him laugh. But there had been something else in that moment. Recognition. 2 people who understood the cost of the work before either of them had spoken about it. In the present, Tessa leaned against the stairwell wall. Her fingers tightened around the photo. Because Nash hadn't just disappeared. He had died. At least, that was the official report. 5 years ago. Northern Syria. An operation that went sideways in the worst possible way. Explosions. Smoke. A collapsing compound. Nash had stayed behind to hold a defensive position, while the rest of the team extracted. They had waited for him at the extraction point for 12 minutes. Then the airstrike came. The entire compound flattened. There had been nothing left to recover. No body. No proof. Just silence. And now this photo. The stairwell door creaked open. Chief Carver stepped inside. "You disappear a lot for someone who works in a trauma center," he said quietly. Tessa didn't look surprised. "You follow people often, Chief. Only the ones who pretend they're not running from something." He nodded toward the photograph in her hand. "Care to share?" She hesitated, then handed it to him. Carver studied the image. "Friend of yours?" "Yes." "Alive?" "I don't know." Carver looked at her carefully. "But you thought he was dead?" "Yes." He exhaled slowly. "Well, that's rarely simple." Down the hallway, Briggs' voice carried from the nurse's station. "Seriously, someone explain this to me." Carver handed the photo back. "You planning to tell them?" "No." "You planning to leave?" Tessa paused. Her eyes drifted toward the hospital windows at the end of the hall. The sky outside was turning amber as the sun lowered over the base. "I hoped I wouldn't have to." Carver nodded slightly. "Something tells me hope isn't your main strategy." She almost smiled. Almost. Across the ER floor, Briggs was still ranting. "A Green Beret salutes her, and nobody thinks that's weird." A resident shrugged. "Maybe he got confused." Briggs scoffed. "Special forces don't confuse rank." Carver walked back into the ER just as Briggs turned. "Chief," Briggs said, "you've been around longer than any of us. Ever seen something like that?" Carver picked up a chart calmly. "Yes." Briggs leaned forward. "And it usually means the person being saluted outranks everyone in the room." Briggs blinked. "But she's a corpsman." Carver met his eyes. "Is she?" The question lingered. Not answered. Not denied. Just hanging in the air like a quiet warning. That night the ER slowed into its late shift rhythm. Fewer patients. Lower lights. The quiet hours when exhaustion crept into people's bones. Tessa finished restocking Trauma Room 3. Her movements were automatic. Precise. But the photograph burned in her pocket. Alive. Nash alive meant one thing. Something had gone very wrong. And the wounded Green Beret's words echoed in her mind. "They're hunting the old team." Her old team. Which meant the list included her. A voice behind her broke the silence. "Commander." She turned quickly. The wounded soldier stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame. He shouldn't have been walking yet. "You're supposed to be in recovery," she said. He smiled weakly. Doctors hate it when I don't follow orders. Get back in bed. Yes, ma'am. But he didn't move. Instead, he lowered his voice. You remember Operation Lantern? The name hit her like cold water. Yes. That's where this started. Her expression hardened. Lantern ended 5 years ago. That's what we were told. He stepped closer. There were files, ma'am, sealed files, things our team wasn't supposed to see. Tessa's pulse slowed again, the way it always did before danger. What kind of things? He swallowed. Human experiments. The room seemed to shrink around them. Enhanced combat trials, he continued quietly. Black site programs. Soldiers pushed past psychological limits. Tessa stared at him. That program was shut down. Not shut down, he said. Moved. A long silence followed. Then he said the words she had been dreading. Nash found proof. Her voice dropped. And now they want him dead. Yes. And you. Anyone who served with him. Her jaw tightened. Across the ER, Briggs laughed loudly at something a nurse said. Normal life continued. People filling charts. Phones ringing. Coffee brewing. But inside Tessa's chest, something heavy settled into place. Because she understood something the others didn't. If Nash had uncovered something powerful enough to make the government hunt its own soldiers, then this was bigger than one man. Bigger than a team. It was the kind of truth people erased entire lives to protect. The wounded soldier shifted uncomfortably. There's one more thing. What? His voice lowered again. Nash left a message. For me. Yes. Her stomach tightened. What did it say? The soldier looked directly at her. He said if this ever happened. He paused. You'd know where to find him. Tessa's heart skipped once. Because she did know. A place no one else would think to look. A place connected to the promise she made when she was 10 years old. The hillside where her father taught her how to breathe between heartbeats. The only place Jonah Nash had ever seen her truly let her guard down. Which meant Nash hadn't just survived. He had been planning. Waiting. And somehow he knew she would come. Tessa closed her eyes briefly. Because the quiet life she had tried to build inside this hospital had just ended. When she opened them again, her voice was steady. Get back to your room, she told the soldier. Yes, ma'am. He turned slowly. But before leaving, he looked over his shoulder. They're already looking for you. I know. Are you going to run? Tessa watched the busy ER floor beyond the doorway. All the ordinary people living ordinary lives. And she felt the weight of the choice forming inside her. No, she said softly. I'm going to finish my shift. Because sometimes courage wasn't loud. Sometimes it looked like a quiet woman finishing her work under fluorescent lights. Even when she knew the war was already coming for her. And somewhere far away, a man everyone believed dead was waiting. Not knowing whether the person he trusted most in the world would come find him, or leave him buried in the shadows where he had learned to survive. Why would someone hunt soldiers who had already given everything? And why had Jonah Nash chosen her, of all people, to find him first? The night shift in the ER moved slowly, like the tide pulling away from the shore. Monitors hummed, chairs creaked. The waiting room television murmured quietly to itself while exhausted families leaned against each other under dim lights. Tessa Harlo finished cleaning the last trauma bay. Her movements were calm, precise. Anyone watching would think nothing had changed. But inside her chest, something had shifted. The kind of shift that only happened when a mission began. Across the room, Briggs leaned back in his chair with a paper cup of coffee. "You ever notice," he said to a nurse, "how the quiet ones are always the weird ones?" The nurse shrugged. "Maybe she's just shy." Briggs snorted. "No one who gets saluted by a green beret is shy." Carver sat nearby, flipping through charts. "You spend a lot of time worrying about other people's stories," he said without looking up. Briggs smirked. "Curiosity is healthy. Curiosity gets people into trouble." Tessa passed behind them without speaking. But she heard every word. And she wasn't offended. Because people filled silence with theories when they didn't understand something. It was human. Fear liked explanations. Even bad ones. She stepped outside into the cool night air of the ambulance bay. The sky above Portsmouth was clear. Stars faint against the glow of the city. She pulled the photograph from her pocket again. Jonah Nash. Walking through an airport. Alive. A soft wind moved through the lot, carrying the smell of rain from somewhere far away. And with it came a memory she had tried not to revisit. 5 years earlier. Syria. The night everything ended. The compound had been chaos. Gunfire echoing off concrete walls. Radio chatter breaking apart into fragments of orders. Tessa had been pinned behind a collapsed vehicle, her rifle empty. Nash had appeared through the smoke like he always did. "Calm. Focused." "Commander," he said quietly. She reloaded quickly. "You're supposed to be extracting. I'm supposed to keep you alive." The building behind them exploded outward in a burst of fire and dust. Their extraction birds circled overhead. They had seconds left. "Go," she ordered. Nash shook his head. "You know I can't do that." That had been the moment she understood something about him. Jonah Nash had never followed orders blindly. He followed people. People he believed in. People he trusted. And somehow, over years of impossible missions, he had decided she was one of them. In the present, Tessa exhaled slowly. Across the parking lot, headlights swept briefly across the pavement. Normal life. People going home. But inside her mind, the pieces of the puzzle were moving again. Operation Lantern. The classified program the wounded soldier had mentioned. Human experimentation. Enhanced combat trials. Tessa had heard whispers about those projects years ago. Rumors buried deep inside intelligence channels. Programs designed to push soldiers past psychological and physical limits. Not just training. Modification. Breaking the human mind and rebuilding it into something more obedient. Most of those projects were supposedly shut down. Supposedly. Her phone vibrated softly in her pocket. An unknown number. She answered immediately. "Yes." A familiar voice spoke on the other end. Low controlled. "Commander." Tessa froze. Her heartbeat slowed instantly. "Jonah." Silence hung for a moment. Then he spoke again. "I was hoping it would still be your number. You're alive. Last time I checked." Her grip tightened around the phone. "You were supposed to be dead." "I was." "Explain." Not over the phone. The wind rustled the trees along the edge of the parking lot. "Why contact me now?" she asked. "Because they're moving faster than I expected." "Who?" "The people behind Lantern." Tessa's eyes narrowed. "What did you find?" "Proof." "Of what?" His voice lowered further. "That the program never stopped." She felt a cold weight settle in her chest. "Jonah." "It's bigger than we thought," he continued. "They've been running trials for years." "On soldiers?" "Yes." How many? Too many. Tessa looked back toward the glowing windows of the ER. Inside were nurses, doctors, patients. Ordinary people. The kind the military existed to protect. What do you want from me? She asked quietly. Another pause. Then Nash answered with absolute honesty. I want you to finish what we started. A distant siren echoed across the city. Why me? She asked. Because you're the only one who won't compromise. You sound very sure. I've seen you hesitate with a rifle to save a child. Her throat tightened slightly. That wasn't hesitation. That was judgment. The silence that followed carried years of shared missions. Shared losses. You said you'd know where to find me, Nash added. I do. Will you come? Tessa closed her eyes briefly. Images flashed through her mind. Her father's hillside. The promise she made to her mother. The quiet life she tried to build inside that hospital. And the wounded Green Beret who had driven 11 hours just to warn her. When she opened her eyes again, her voice was steady. When? Tomorrow night. Coordinates. You already know them. Yes, she did. The old ridge outside her hometown in Virginia. The place where wind moved through tall grass like whispers. The place where her father taught her patience. The place Jonah Nash had once visited during a rare moment of peace between missions. I'll be there, she said. Good. But before the call ended, she asked the question that had been sitting quietly behind everything else. Jonah. Yeah. Why did you really survive Syria? A faint breath passed through the phone. Then his answer came. Because someone inside Lantern pulled me out. Her stomach dropped. They saved you. No. His voice turned darker. They studied me. The line went silent. The call ended. Tessa stood alone in the ambulance bay, the night air suddenly colder than before. Because the implications were terrifying. If the Lantern program had captured Nash, then he wasn't just a witness anymore. He was evidence. And evidence like that didn't stay alive for long. Carver stepped outside behind her. You look like someone just handed you bad news, he said. She slipped the phone back into her pocket. Not bad. Worse. Yes. Carver studied her quietly. You leaving tonight? No. Tomorrow? Yes. He nodded slowly. You know they'll ask questions. I know. You planning to answer them? Tessa looked back at the ER again. At the people inside who believed the world was mostly safe. No, she said softly. Sometimes silence protects people. Carver crossed his arms. You coming back? That question lingered longer than the others. Because the truth was, she didn't know. I hope so, she finally said. Carver accepted the answer without pushing further. Because soldiers like her rarely made promises about survival. They simply walked toward the next mission. Inside the hospital, Briggs watched through the glass doors as Tessa stood outside under the parking lot lights. She's leaving, he muttered. The nurse beside him frowned. How do you know? Briggs shrugged. I've seen that look before. What look? The one people get when something bigger than their job shows up. Back outside, Tessa stared at the stars above the city. Tomorrow night, she would return to the ridge where her father once taught her how to breathe between heartbeats. But this time, she wouldn't be going there to remember. She would be going there to start a war she never wanted to fight again. Because somewhere out there, Jonah Nash was waiting. And the people who created the Lantern program were already moving to erase both of them. But there was something they had forgotten. Tessa Harlo had spent years learning how to survive in the shadows. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room became the most dangerous one when the lights finally went out. Why would a man who had survived death itself choose the one place in the world where she could find him, and risk leading every hunter straight to her doorstep? The ER clock ticked past midnight. Inside the hospital, the world still moved in its steady rhythm. Patients arriving, charts being filled, tired nurses exchanging quiet jokes over coffee. But Tessa Harlo stood by the window at the end of the corridor, watching the darkness outside. Her shift would end in 2 hours. 2 hours before she stepped back into a life she had spent years trying to bury. Behind her, Briggs leaned against the nurse's station again. "You're leaving tomorrow, aren't you?" he said. She didn't turn around. "What makes you think that?" He shrugged. "People don't stand at windows like that unless they're saying goodbye to something." She finally faced him. "You should focus on your patients." He studied her for a moment. "You know," he said, softer this time, "I gave you a hard time." Tessa waited. "But that soldier," Briggs continued, "he looked at you like you saved his life before." She said nothing. Briggs sighed. "Whatever you did out there, it must have been something." Her response came quietly. "We all just do our jobs." But the words carried a weight he couldn't understand. "Because some jobs followed you long after the mission ended." 2 hours later, Tessa placed her hospital badge on the locker room bench. The small plastic card looked strangely ordinary for something that had meant stability. Normal life. Routine. She ran her thumb along its edge once, then left it behind. Outside, Chief Carver waited beside his old truck. "You're punctual," he said. "I try to be." He handed her a small canvas bag. Inside were supplies she hadn't asked for. Medical gauze, flashlights, a compact radio. "Thought you might need these," he said. "You didn't have to." "Didn't hurt." They stood there in the quiet parking lot for a moment. "You ever think about staying?" he asked. Tessa considered the question honestly. "Every day." And she looked toward the hospital entrance. "At some point, the past catches up." Carver nodded. "War has a long memory." She climbed into her truck. The engine started with a low rumble. "Be careful out there," he said. She met his eyes. "I always am." But as she drove away, both of them knew the truth. Careful didn't always mean safe. The highway stretched dark and empty as she left Portsmouth behind. The world beyond the hospital lights felt wider, colder, familiar in ways she hadn't missed. Wind rushed past the windows as miles slipped under her tires. And with each mile, the past returned more clearly. The old missions. The quiet briefings. Jonah Nash leaning over a map with that steady calm that made everyone else breathe easier. He had been the kind of leader who never raised his voice, never rushed decisions, the kind who carried responsibility without ever reminding anyone he had it, which made his survival even harder to understand. If Lantern had captured him, what had they done to him? The question stayed with her all night as she drove. By dawn, the Virginia hills rose ahead. Rolling land, thick forests, places where wind moved through tall grass, exactly the same way it had when she was a child. She turned onto the old gravel road, leading toward the ridge. The tires crunched softly beneath the truck. Memories waited here. Her father's quiet voice, the smell of gun oil, the sound of wind bending grass in slow waves. She parked at the bottom of the hill and climbed the rest on foot. The sunrise painted the horizon in pale orange light. For a moment, everything felt still, almost peaceful. But soldiers learned long ago that silence wasn't always safe. She reached the ridge just as the sun crested the trees. And there he was. Jonah Nash stood near the edge of the hill, looking out across the valley. Older, thinner, but unmistakably the same man. He turned when he heard her footsteps. For a second neither of them spoke. 5 years of absence stretched between them. Then Nash gave the same faint smile he had worn the day they met. "Commander." She studied him carefully. "You look terrible." He laughed quietly. "That's fair." They stood facing each other in the morning light. "You survived an airstrike," she said. "Barely. Then Lantern found you." His expression darkened. "Yes." "What did they do?" He hesitated. "Later." Her eyes sharpened. "You called me here for a reason." Nash reached into his jacket and pulled out a small encrypted drive. "This." She took it. "What's on it?" "Everything." "Define everything." "Personnel lists, research data, locations of Lantern facilities." Her pulse slowed again. The familiar calm of mission focus. "You want to expose them?" "Yes." "You know what that means." "They'll come after us." "Not just us," she said quietly. "Anyone who helps." Nash nodded. "I know." Wind moved across the ridge, carrying the distant sound of birds. For a moment, the place looked like nothing more than a quiet hillside. But both of them knew the truth. This was where the war started again. "What happened to the rest of Orion?" she asked. "Two disappeared." "Dead." "Maybe." "And the others?" "Running." Tessa looked down at the drive in her hand. "Years of secrets. Years of lies." "You trust me with this," she said. "I always did." But before she could respond, Nash's head tilted slightly. "Listening." Tessa heard it too. Distant engines. Multiple vehicles climbing the gravel road below. Her voice stayed calm. "You were followed." "Not directly." "How many?" "Hard to say." The engines grew louder. She looked down the hill. Black SUVs appeared between the trees. Moving fast. Nash exhaled slowly. "Well, that didn't take long." Tessa slipped the drive into her jacket pocket. "How far does the road go?" "Dead end." "Of course it does." The vehicles stopped at the base of the hill. Doors opened. Men stepped out. Armed. Disciplined. Moving with the coordination of trained operators. Not amateurs. Not local police. Lantern had found them. Nash glanced at her. "You ever miss quiet hospital shifts?" "Sometimes." She scanned the terrain quickly. Ridge line. Tree cover. Angles. Everything her father had taught her came back like muscle memory. But something else stirred inside her too. Not fear. Resolve. Because this time, the mission wasn't about eliminating a target. It was about protecting the truth. The first agents began climbing the hill. Weapons ready. Nash gave a small sigh. "You know, I was hoping we'd have more time to talk." Tessa almost smiled. "We still will." "How?" She looked at the rising sun over the valley. "Because they think we're running." The agents moved closer. Careful. Methodical. But they didn't understand the ground. They didn't understand her. Sometimes strength wasn't loud. Sometimes it looked like patience. Sometimes it waited quietly, until the moment the other side made their first mistake. Nash glanced sideways. "You've got a plan." "Yes." He nodded. "Good." Because deep down, He had always known something about Tessa Harlo. The world underestimated quiet people. But quiet people were often the ones who survived the longest. And as the agents climbed the ridge toward them, the real battle was only just beginning. But there was one thing neither of them knew yet. Someone else was watching that hillside from far away. Someone connected to Lantern. Someone who had spent years studying soldiers like them. And that observer wasn't worried. Because in his mind, this meeting on the ridge wasn't a threat. It was an opportunity. An opportunity to capture something far more valuable than data. Two of the most resilient operatives the program had ever seen. Alive. Why would they come in broad daylight, unless they believed the people on that ridge had nowhere left to run? The black SUVs waited at the base of the hill like dark insects against the pale morning light. Men moved between them with practiced coordination, rifles raised, eyes scanning the ridge line. Professional, not reckless, which meant they believed they had already won. Tessa Harlo crouched low beside the tall grass near the ridge. The wind brushed through the hillside in slow waves, just like it had when she was 10 years old. Just like it had the first time her father handed her a rifle and told her something she never forgot. Patience beats panic. Jonah Nash knelt beside her, watching the agents climb. "How many?" he asked quietly. "8," she replied. "Armed?" "Yes." "Military?" "Private contractors," she said, "too clean for regular soldiers." Nash nodded slightly. "That fits Lantern." The men below were spreading out now, climbing the ridge in a wide formation. They expected resistance, but not from two people standing in the open. Tessa studied their movement patterns. Angles, spacing, confidence. Then she noticed something else. They weren't firing. "Not yet. They want us alive," she said. Nash followed her gaze. "That makes things worse." "Yes." Alive meant interrogation. And Lantern didn't believe in gentle questions. A voice echoed up the hill. "Commander Harlo." One of the agents stepped forward halfway up the slope. He removed his sunglasses slowly. "Let's make this easier." Tessa stood calmly. Nash frowned. "You sure about that?" "Yes." The agent spread his arms slightly. "Director Haverson asked me to deliver a message." Tessa felt the name settle like ice. Haverson. One of the architects of the Lantern program. A man whose career was built on secrets buried so deep they barely existed. "What message?" she asked. "That this doesn't have to end badly." She tilted her head. "Funny, that's usually how it ends." The agent smiled thinly. "You have something that belongs to us." "The drive." "Yes." She reached into her jacket, pulled it out. The small device glinted in the morning sun. The agents tensed instantly. "Careful," the man warned. "You damage that and people die." Tessa studied the drive for a moment. "You're already killing people." "That's an unfortunate misunderstanding." She almost laughed. Because men like him always said things like that. "We're offering you a choice," he continued. "Come with us quietly. And your hospital stays safe." For the first time, Nash looked sharply at her. They had done their homework. Of course they had. Lantern didn't just hunt targets. They studied weaknesses. The agent continued smoothly. "You built a nice life there, Commander." Tessa said nothing. "I imagine the doctors and nurses would be very disappointed if something unfortunate happened to their building." The wind passed over the ridge again. Tessa felt something familiar rise inside her chest. Anger. Not loud, Not explosive, just steady, the kind that sharpened focus instead of clouding it. She looked down at the man. You threatened innocent people. They're collateral. No, she said quietly. They're human. He shrugged. Same thing sometimes. Tessa closed her hand around the drive. You know, she said softly, my father taught me something on this hill. The agent frowned slightly. That hesitation gets people killed. She shook her head. That patience gives you time to see the truth. The agent glanced briefly at his men. Commander, don't make this harder. But something about her posture made him uneasy. Because she didn't look cornered. She looked calm. Too calm. And then he realized something. Where Nash? The space beside her was empty. The moment of distraction was all it took. From the tree line halfway down the ridge, a smoke grenade burst open. White clouds rolled across the hillside instantly. Visibility collapsed. Move, the agent shouted. But Nash was already in motion. He moved through the smoke like someone who had memorized every inch of the terrain. Because he had. 5 years ago, during the only peaceful afternoon he and Tessa had ever shared here. Two agents stumbled forward blindly. Tessa stepped sideways into the grass. One precise movement. Her elbow struck the first agent's wrist. The rifle dropped. A second later, she had the weapon in her hands. Not firing wildly. Just controlled bursts that forced the others backward. Nash emerged from the smoke behind another agent and disarmed him before the man even turned. Within seconds, the formation collapsed. Confusion replaced coordination. Fall back, someone yelled. The SUVs below roared to life. More agents poured out. Tessa grabbed Nash's arm. This way. They ran along the ridge toward the tree line. Branches snapped beneath their boots. Behind them, engines revved and men shouted into radios. How far? Nash asked. 2 miles to the old fire road. Extraction. No. He glanced at her. You have another plan. Yes. They reached the forest just as gunfire cracked through the trees behind them. Bark splintered from trunks. Leaves rained down. But the forest swallowed sound quickly. And Tessa moved through it like someone who had grown up there. Because she had. 20 minutes later, they reached the abandoned fire lookout tower at the far end of the valley. Tessa climbed the ladder halfway up. Opened the small metal panel inside. Nash watched with curiosity. You hid something here. Yes. What? She pulled out a small satellite transmitter. Old military hardware. But reliable. You planned this. No, she said. I hoped I'd never need it. She activated the transmitter. A blinking light began sending a signal into orbit. Who are we calling? Nash asked. People Lantern can't control. He smiled slightly. Good answer. The sound of vehicles echoed faintly through the trees behind them. They were still being hunted. But now the truth was moving too. Through satellites. Through encrypted channels. Toward journalists, investigators, and commanders who had never heard the word lantern before. Within hours, the drive's contents would spread farther than any secret program could contain. Nash leaned against the tower railing. You just started a storm. Yes. Think we'll survive it. Tessa looked out across the forest. The sunlight had grown brighter now, burning away the morning fog. I don't know. He studied her quietly. You ever regret coming back? She thought about the hospital. The quiet break room. Briggs complaining about coffee. Chief Carver watching people like a patient guardian. I regret leaving them in danger, she said. But running wouldn't have saved them. Nash nodded slowly. Because that was the thing about people like Tessa Harlo. They didn't fight for glory. They fought for the ordinary lives that existed far away from battlefields. The lives inside hospitals, inside homes, inside quiet places where people believed the world was safe. A helicopter appeared on the horizon. Not lantern. Navy markings. Someone had received the signal. Nash exhaled. Well, looks like your friend showed up. Tessa watched the aircraft approach. For the first time in days, the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. But she knew the truth. The fight wasn't over. Lantern would try to bury this again. Secrets rarely died easily. Still, something had changed. The silence was broken. And sometimes that was enough to start the fall of things built in darkness. The helicopter landed in the clearing below. As they climbed aboard, Nash glanced at her. You know, he said, the ER probably needs its quiet medic back. Tessa looked down at the forest, disappearing beneath the helicopter. Maybe one day. Maybe when the storm passed. Because strength didn't always look like standing on a battlefield. Sometimes it looked like showing up quietly, where people needed help. And sometimes the strongest soldiers were the ones who chose to heal instead of destroy. As the helicopter carried them toward the horizon, the first reports about the Lantern program began spreading across the world. Investigations. Questions. Truth rising slowly into the light. And somewhere far away, inside a quiet hospital emergency room, someone noticed the window seat was empty. Because the quietest person in the room had left to protect something bigger than herself. And the lesson she carried from that hillside remained simple. Sometimes courage isn't loud. Sometimes it doesn't shout or demand recognition. Sometimes it simply acts. And when it does, the world changes quietly around it.